Imagine one line on a presidential memo that, overnight, reroutes billions, shuts mills, and makes your contractor raise the price of your new deck. That's not drama. That's policy, raw, public, and immediate. Tonight, tariffs, a $13 billion Canadian housing blitz, modular factories promising 10,000 homes a year, and a split-screen leadership fight between Washington and Ottawa that's about to redraw North American trade for years. How we got here. Two governments. One set of decisions. On one side, the U.S. has re-energized anti-dumping and countervailing reviews of Canadian softwood lumber and in 2025 moved duty rates sharply higher, with preliminary combined rates that for some major Canadian producers now run into the tens of percent and for the largest cases reach as high as approximately 46% on specific company lines. Those administrative moves are why lumber shipments that used to cross the border freely now arrive with a tax tag. On the other side, Canada's new Prime Minister launched Build Canada Homes, a federal agency with an initial $13 billion commitment aimed at building affordable homes at scale, using public land, financing, and a big push for modular construction. The announcement landed as Ottawa is trying to blunt the damage from the tariff shock. New insight the competitor missed. The tariffs we're talking about are not a single one's number, they're a patchwork of company anti-dumping, CVD rates, preliminary administrative findings, and potential executive orders that together create asymmetric pain across provinces and manufacturers. That means a mill in BC can face a very different outcome from one in Quebec, and those differences shape local politics. Fast, Canada's vulnerable backbone, forest sector is massive, nearly 200,000 workers, more than $20 billion contribution to GDP, and a supply chain that still sends the lion's share of its softwood to the United States. In 2024, roughly two-thirds of Canada's softwood lumber production was exported. Of that exported volume, nearly 90% went to the U.S. market. That concentration is the strategic vulnerability. What the tariffs do in practice. Higher duties raise the floor price for Canadian lumber in the U.S., which reduces Canadian competitiveness and chokes off orders, which then forces mills to idle, lay off workers, or cut shifts. The shock propagates. Suppliers, truckers, loggers, and small towns feel it almost immediately. Historic precedent shows layoffs spike when duty actions bite. This isn't theoretical. New insight the competitor missed. Indigenous and rural economies are disproportionately exposed. Indigenous forestry employment is significant. An estimated 11,000 Indigenous workers participate in the sector. So durable tariff shocks are not just a trade statistic. They're a social and regional crisis with reconciliation implications. Any trade policy response must account for that. Build Canada Homes. The plan, the math. And the weak link. What Ottawa announced is ambitious and politically necessary. A new agency. Initial $13 billion seed funding. Commitments to build on federal land 4,000 homes on 6 federal sites were flagged. And financing tools to scale prefabrication and modular housing. The stated goal, accelerate supply and reduce costs for first-time buyers and vulnerable households. But here's the rub. Modular factories need inputs. Lumber, OSB, fittings, fasteners, insulation, and several of those inputs are suddenly more expensive or less reliable because of tariffs and supply chain disruption. A single modular factory can produce roughly 1,000 to 2,000 homes a year under good conditions. To deliver tens of thousands of units quickly, Canada needs dozens of factories, streamlined approvals, and steady, affordable inputs. That's a lot of moving parts to synchronize while tariffs bloat material costs. New insight the competitor missed. Build Canada Homes' biggest lever isn't just money, it's land and regulatory certainty. If the federal agency can deliver pre-approved sites, fast zoning approvals, and standardized modular plans, each dollar of federal subsidy buys more units. In other words, bureaucratic smoothing can multiply supply faster than raw cash in the near term, but it still can't make lumber appear out of thin air. The U.S. side, short-term win, long-term costs. From Washington's perspective, the tariffs are a lever. Protect us mills, save immediate jobs, and show domestic constituencies that America First translates into action. In several cases, the Commerce Department's decisions have already increased duty rates and tightened Canadian access to the US market, a direct protection for us producers, but protection comes at a price. Homebuilders and consumers face higher input costs. Analysts and industry groups warn that removing Canadian supply quickly forces U.S. mills to ramp up capacity, which is possible but costly and slow. Estimates suggest the U.S. would need to add billions of board feet of output or accept higher prices and slower homebuilding to offset losses. In short, tariff defense protects jobs in the fenceline mills but raises costs for U.S. construction and homebuyers. Down the road, new insight the competitor missed. Tariffs can temporarily hide inflationary pressure by protecting domestic producers, but they shift the burden to consumers and downstream industries, contractors, affordable housing projects, builders, the final tally is rarely just the headline job number, it's the net jobs effect across industries once higher prices and reduced demand ripple through. The politics, rhetoric, reality, and the 250% claim. The headlines were loud. The U.S. president sparred with Ottawa and threatened steep reciprocal duties, at one point throwing out the specter of 250% tariffs on dairy. That 250% number grabbed eyes. But fact-checkers pointed out something crucial. The 250% figure exists in tariff schedules as an over-quota rate, a punitive level that only applies if exporters exceed strict quota limits. For most U.S. dairy exports to Canada, in practice, those quotas aren't being hit, so the 250% line is technically true on paper but misleading in everyday trade terms. Carney's rhetorical playbook has been different. Large national projects and diversification deals with the EU and other partners, highlighting a long game rather than tit-for-tat headlines. The EU-Canada Strategic and Defense Partnership, plus an industrial policy dialogue, are part of that pivot. But optics don't pay. Factory payrolls. New insight. The competitor missed. Public rhetoric, for example, 250%, is a negotiation tool as much as a policy. Washington's public threats create leverage. Ottawa's public programs create domestic political cover. The smarter play for both sides from a risk management view is to signal willingness to negotiate while building fallback capacity. Modular plants. Export diversification. Quietly. Global reactions and the bigger chessboard. This isn't just a bilateral spat. BRICS. Nations publicly criticized the proliferation of unilateral tariffs and trade coercion. China and other capitals have warned against weaponizing trade and have executed retaliatory measures in parallel disputes. Meanwhile, Canada has been actively deepening ties with the EU, the UK, and exploring Mercosur, a deliberate diversification to reduce over-reliance on the US market. That geopolitical pivot is deliberate. Canada is buying time and markets while it rebuilds resilience. New insight. The competitor missed. The trade war supercharges an already underway shift in procurement and supply chain strategy. NATO and EU security cooperation with Canada now extends into industrial policy, joint procurement, critical minerals, processing, and defense industrial policy. That means trade policy and security policy are merging, and Canada's alternatives aren't just commercial markets. They're strategic partnerships. EUSAFE procurement, UK working group, port investments to reach Asia. What's next? The scenarios. We should think in 3 realistic scenarios, and every one matters for your wallet, your town, and your next home purchase. 1. Negotiated truce. Quiet diplomacy yields a deal that eases duties, with commitments on quotas and procurement. This would stabilize lumber flows, keep build timelines on track, and allow Ottawa time to scale modular capacity. Odds possible, but it needs concessions on both sides and credible enforcement. 2. Persistent tariff equilibrium. Duties remain elevated, so Canadian lumber producers pivot to Asia and Europe. Longer shipments, higher logistics costs. Ottawa doubles down on modular factories, finances them, and focuses Build Canada homes on public land builds and social housing. Outcome: slower and more expensive supply recovery. Regional pain in mill towns. 3. Escalation and global backlash. Tariffs widen to other sectors. BRICS and EU countermeasures bite us, exporters. Global value chains reconfigure. Short-term recession risk rises on both sides of the border. Consumers everywhere pay more. Politics hardens. New insight. The competitor missed. Modular housing could be the tactical winner only if federal funding is tied to supply chain guarantees, for example, conditional loans that require sourcing a percentage of materials from non-tariff impacted suppliers or long-term purchase agreements. In practice, that would de-risk factories and smooth financing costs faster than ad hoc grants. It's the policy lever Ottawa should be using now. Practical takeaways for viewers. Us in Canada. If you're in the US, expect localized benefits to mill towns where production ramps up, but also expect higher prices for framing lumber and home building projects in the short term. If you're a contractor, reprice your bids. If you're a homeowner, lock interest rates and understand material surcharges might appear. If you're in Canada, watch for provincial relief programs, job retraining announcements, and Build Canada Homes First projects. A batch of 4,000 federal land units was flagged. If you live in a mill town, expect federal and provincial supports, but also a hard pivot to export diversification and modular factory jobs that may not replace every lost mill shift. New insight. The competitor missed. Homebuyers on either side of the border should watch modular factory announcements closely. Factory output introduces new regional price dynamics. For example, a factory in Ontario lowering delivery costs in the GTA versus a supply shortage in Atlantic Canada. That microeconomic shift can change where developers build next. This fight is more than it's a stress test for a continent's supply chains, a federal housing promise, and the politics of power projection. Washington's tariff lever is blunt, effective in protecting some jobs immediately, but expensive and disruptive. Ottawa's Build Canada Homes is bold, and it could change lives, but it runs straight into real material constraints that raw cash alone won't solve. Final new insight. The real winner will be whichever side can stitch trade policy to industrial policy the fastest, not just through headlines, but through enforceable contracts. Logistics investments, Prince Rupert, CN Investments, and targeted financing for factories that lock in reliable supply chains. That's where policy meets manufacturing reality. You've been watching Celeb Star Buzz, where superpowers get reality. If you want the next episode to break down who really profits from tariffs and how to protect your wallet, hit subscribe, smash that bell, and comment below. Are you seeing lumber price hikes in your area? We'll follow up with crowdsourced reports from real builders across the border. This was Celeb Star Buzz, where finance meets fire. Subscribe now, before the next tariff drops.